Alrighty. Hello, my name is Alec Burnett, just for the preparing for community practice group discussion.
Hi, I'm McKenna Cole.
And yeah, so we're just going to talk about the first question about cultural discourses about mental health and illness. And then what are the messages that you received in your culture of origin, family of origin, about mental health or mental illness? And then, yeah, do you want to go first, McKenna?
Yeah, so within my family of origin, mental health was pretty regularly talked about, but more so in like a clinical or professional aspect. My mom is a marriage and family therapist, which kind of normalized the concept of mental illnesses and treatments, but more in the sense of um, kind of talking about it in that more professional sense rather than like going into like a deeper um, touching on those emotional aspects.
Mhm.
And then the environment I grew up in outside of the household, I would say there was quite a bit of stigma, so that it wasn't talked about. It seemed like taboo to talk about like the mental health or like those aspects other than what I was talking about in my home, which was interesting. Definitely the duality of like a clinical aspect and stigma outside of.
Right.
What
And I
about
was thinking,
you?
like, or for me, just going off of your point too, it's like, if you were going to see like a mental health therapist, it was for something very particular. So there wasn't just the more like particular mental illness or what with that. So yeah, we definitely wasn't talked about. Yeah, I grew up in a small rural town in Northern California, so wasn't a lot of even access to mental health. You never talked about it. I know too, for me, just community and kind of my family growing up had a strong mix of like Christian values and kind of just a small town, I would say, attitudes. um, Kind of in our community, yeah, there wasn't a lot of wasn't a lot of talk about mental health, and it just wasn't really understood as a whole. Um, I think just really discussions about emotions and all that really didn't happen a lot, I would say. Um, and two, just thinking about it, like when you're in more of a religious community, it's like, okay, it's more around like prayer and like talking with people like at church. I feel like that was part of like those were the resources that you're going to, not like a therapist. But now I just think like
Yeah.
growing up, looking at my family, um, it's a lot different now. Like we're way more open-minded with mental health. Just because my brother's a therapist, and then my parents are divorced, so it's like okay, now it's like okay, it's something we kind of had to do. I would say,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I feel like I got a lot to talk about. But let's see. I was just thinking back to kind of where I am now too. Um, just I mentioned my brother's therapist, so obviously we talk about a lot. Just going to college too, that was a good thing. Getting out of a small town, being exposed to different people, more education on different communities. Um, yeah, I'd say just that's kind of where the curiosity started for me. Just with people and just being exposed to that. And I think, or I can
You
talk
touched
more
on
to,
an
yeah.
interesting
Mhm.
point that about like locationally or geographically, like where we
Mhm.
are impacting the way that mental health is talked about. Where for myself as well, when I left for college, I went up to Washington State in the Seattle area, and
Okay.
mental health was a lot more um, open and talked about, and just
Hmm.
that like geographically, I plays a role in the way we talk about and approach mental health.
For sure. I was thinking maybe that's a Pacific Northwest thing because I was in Oregon. So I was like, maybe it's
Mhm.
talking about more just in those kind of areas, it seemed. Um, yeah, I was going to talk about, I mean, we got a lot to talk about, or a lot to talk about, but I was going to talk about too, like seeing like my experience with seeing a counselor, like wasn't until after college. So, I mean, probably I needed it definitely before then, but it was kind of like, okay, now I hit like the existential crisis mode where it's like, okay, now I need to figure out what the, like, it reached that point where, um,
Yeah.
I
Which
think,
touches on, I think, that next question of
yeah,
resources that were available and like when we take advantage of those resources is more of like once you're in crisis or like entering that territory, I feel like is more of the common, what I saw more common in like growing up rather than going as like preventative measures. Um,
right, right. Which, I mean, yeah, which makes sense at the same time too, if you don't have, depending on your income and whatnot too. You wouldn't want to go to that until it's like, but now I think like for me, my family was middle class growing up, so I don't think it would have been a huge issue, to, but really, I think it wasn't. Probably, I mean, high school, into high school, that's probably where I could have started, just with like my parents uh, being divorced and whatnot, just like, and it would have built like a good thing, good like framework for being in college, I think for sure. Um,
I
but
agree.
let's see. Kind of just talking about all of it naturally. But yeah, that was just going into our second question about the resources. Um, I think, yeah, mainly just being in, or access to resources would have just helped with boundaries. That would have been the big thing. And I think too, just looking at the different options that are available now, I think like telehealth would have been a great thing to have in call. And I think it was available, but yeah, never really talked about. But what's your experience with that?
Yeah. Again, because my mom was a therapist
Mm.
and
Yeah.
I grew up with a lot of anxiety and depression from a young age. So I did start therapy relatively early on. Um, so it was mainly just kind of like the thought of like CBT therapy, of like just normal
Mhm.
like talk therapy, was the main resource and like form of therapy that I was aware of. And then um, kind of those larger ones of like inpatient treatment centers.
Mhm.
Um, just mainly it was either resources that I'm hearing about through my mom or what's represented on um, TV,
Right.
which I think is often not an accurate representation of um, mental health and mental illness.
Mhm.
So it was really interesting, like either on a very small scale, like clinical level, or like media representation, which is like
Right.
very dramatized.
Yeah, not like the middle, but where I feel like now we could just kind of do our own research and kind of see what best fits for us, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. Now being aware, especially going through the program, aware of kind of all of those in between aspects. And like
Mhm.
you had said, like telehealth would have been, I think, a game changer, especially in college. And didn't really know about it until like around COVID when I think it became a lot. I mean, it kind of became the
Yeah,
norm.
definitely,
Um,
definitely. Yeah, same with me. I think, yeah, and I think being in college too, at least like my mindset, it's like,
mhm.
okay, if you're going to a therapist, like, or it's taking a lot of time to do that, it's like a whole nother thing. It's like, and maybe it's just like the stigma of just like, okay, wow, this guy's going to see it there. Like, not that, I don't know. Yeah, the telehealth, you could definitely just be, it's on your own time and your comfort level and kind of,
Mhm.
kind of private, With that time,
It-
I wasn't as like as comfortable talking about it.
yeah, and there's, I think you touched on that like internalized stigma of like, oh, like I don't necessarily want people to know that like or at that time like not necessarily wanting people to know like oh like I'm going off campus and like driving to a different area for a mental
Hmm.
health reason
Right,
um
right.
is a I think it's interesting the duality of stigma where there's
Hmm.
like what we see and then also what we keep with us. um I know for me that was a big piece.
Let's see. Kind of just going on into our next question. How do you think that mental health stigma can contribute to cross-cultural barriers to care? Um, yeah, I can start kind of with this one, but basically just kind of what we talked about. It can discourage individuals from like seeking help, just because the fear of that in their community, like it, and it's looked at different for different cultures and whatnot as well. Um, and don't really think that's really the main. They don't think it's the main issue is mental health. Maybe they think it's something physical or um, and kind of how to go. Yeah, depending on religion too. Like I mentioned, they can go to maybe their church member if they're in a church or just some kind of elder in the community. Um, but yeah.
That piece was one of the things that had come up for me. I grew up in the Catholic church, so it was oftentimes um, like when people are struggling, it was more oftentimes like phrased as not mental health, but like um, a like faltering in their faith or like God.
Okay. Hmm.
And so, like you had said, you're going to the like priests or you're going to confession and talking about those pieces within a religious kind of like religious lens. Um, and then an aspect for my family was that cultural piece. My dad is a first generation Irish, so my grandpa like was very much like pull yourself up from your bootstraps. Like
Hmm.
it was like when you talked about like, oh, I'm feeling like depressed, it was like
Right.
I survived a famine. Like, what do you know about like
Yes.
those?
Yeah, definitely the older, yeah, generation has to go
Mhm.
through those where it's
Yeah,
very particular. Like if you did have any issues, okay, it's related directly to that. But they probably didn't talk
exactly.
about that. And it's just like that's kind of what I was gonna yeah, go on, just for me being, being a male, especially like white male, you're just not those kind of issues like depression, those aren't the issues that you're gonna really talk about. And that community for men too is not around. I think, it's definitely gotten better in my generation, but
Yeah, even just like the gender aspect of, that notion of like, if we're believing that men don't cry, there's no space to have the conversations of like men and boys are experiencing like depression, anxiety, all of these various forms. If we don't
mhm.
even acknowledge the fact that like it's normal to cry, there's no space for that.
Right.
Um,
Able to get those, yeah,
and
emotions.
which kind of like I also feel like goes into that culture. Exactly, yeah, where there's so many like areas where those emotions are seen as weakness that I think really contributes to that like cross-cultural barriers of it's not talked about or it's viewed as a weakness. So then you don't know about the resources or the resources you know about, you don't feel comfortable like taking advantage of or using.
Hmm.
Um, and then, I mean, there's a whole other aspect of like the mistrust in healthcare systems for a lot of different communities, based off of like historical reasons, but then also like um, within individual communities that like fear or mistrust, I think definitely creates a stigma and like prevents a lot of people from accessing a lot of resources that I think everyone can benefit from.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even just, the language barrier, yeah, just misunderstanding symptoms. I mean, like being referred somewhere where they don't actually know. I think actually we might have talked about that in our lecture, but where yeah, they're being yeah, because of some kind of language barrier, just situation with what's going on, they got referred to a therapist, and it's like they weren't having those issues. They just didn't understand the link. Like their family just didn't understand. Or they yeah weren't able to communicate that to their healthcare provider, and they like went to a therapist and it was like not able to do anything. It was just a language barrier. Like there's little things like that that can happen just because of difference in culture and yeah and all that. Let's see here. We're kind of into okay. Last question. But how do you think that your exposure to mental health stigma may influence your ability to prioritize self-care once you start seeing clients, and then the plan to prioritize self-care once you start seeing clients? A little two-part question.
Um,
Uh,
I do think my exposure to the world of mental health from a young age, both being in therapy and having my mom as a therapist, does help kind of like minimize the stigma around like understanding the importance of prioritizing self-care. Um, but at the same time, I have an internal stigma around like being able to be like, I know I should prioritize mental health and like
mhm.
self-care. Um, but I personally struggle with like in practice implementing that. And I know that's something that like as a mother, I need to like get on top of, but even
Yeah, for
more
sure.
so figuring it out before being there, or before being a therapist, seeing clients, um, because of the whole, I mean, if you can't help yourself, you can't help others, but also like the bigger aspect of like if you're burnt out or you're not, if you have, what is it, compassion fatigue, like you're not
Mhm.
gonna be like the best therapist possible. You're gonna be entering like dangerous, like ethical territory.
It's like,
Um,
and that was my big note I had on there is trying to anticipate your own needs. I think we're definitely going to have to do that. Well, I was also thinking too, there's the guilt of like, we have all these self-care activities that we talked about, and,
mhm.
people are saying they're doing, and if you don't do it, you're like, oh, dang it, I should have done that. But it's like, also, it's just the balance of, yeah, really, it's the work, work-life balance we talked about too. Um,
Yeah. And I think
trying.
I try to tell myself that like part of the self-care is like giving yourself grace when you're not doing all of those pieces that we talk about being like, I should be having a great healthy salad and then going for a walk and then like
Mhm.
meditating, also finding time to do all of my schoolwork and like
Right.
other and socialize. It's knowing that, like trying to prioritize, but also giving yourself grace to be like, okay, well, I didn't get up and like exercise or have like proper movement this week, but like I can do this piece that's like accessible this week and try again next week to do like the larger scale pieces. Which is like that's the piece where I'm at right now. Like my plan
Mhm.
prioritizing is just trying to do like some of those smaller pieces so that then I can start hitting those larger pieces of like
Yeah,
self-care.
I think, and just in another one of our classes, of course, we're always going to be talking about self-care as therapists. It was more like, for me, I'm just used to, or like one of my, self-care things is, physical activity, going on a run or just doing anything at the gym. But it's like, okay, I don't have that same amount of time that I used to. So why not just spend, be appreciative of the time that you do spend on something. I don't know, it could be like 20 minutes. I think sometimes it needs to be this big old thing, and then I'm trying to plan it. And then by the time that happens, I've already, like, the time is gone. It's like, just do it, do what you can, and then move on. I
Yeah.
think, um, I know, especially, I just think it's there, or I'm thinking of other like my self-care things to do. But as a therapist, it's going to be good probably to, for me, check in with other therapists, talk, like have somebody because they're going through something similar as you are. Like I think it might start to like the communities that I'm with. Um, it'll be nice basically being with a therapist, having somebody going through similar things that you're going through, like where other people might have a little bit of
Yeah,
trouble
that
relating to that.
community.
Hmm. Especially, yeah,
Hmm. Being like,
healthcare.
okay, what are you guys doing in your 5 minute break between clients to like take care of yourself? Or like even just like, what's a 1 minute hack of self-care that you guys are doing?
Hmm.
Having people
For sure.
all balancing self-care and seeing clients and prioritizing self-care so that we can see clients. I think in the same way of like having that community of therapists and colleagues so that you can talk about like your cases in like obviously within the realm of confidentiality,
Right.
but also talking about the self-care.
Yeah, it's more just like in
Um,
general, yeah, because you can't talk, oh, this particular client who's this thing, like for confidentiality reasons, of course, but more just like the general theme of like, okay, I've been taking on this issue. How do I help with that issue? And more, I think what I'm going to try to do, like if you're asking for help from, other therapists as well, um, it can be simple as write them down, try it out one day. Don't try to do everything at once. You know, try this out, see how,
yes.
for a little bit, see
Yeah.
how it goes. I think, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, we have so many different self-care, methods now that people have talked about, but what works best for you? That's basically what we're trying to figure out throughout this whole program is really just what works best for us as a therapist, self-care, and all that. Um, yeah, I hope to try everything, but not overdo it. Self-care, but
And that's that fine balance of like figuring out, I think you worded it great, figuring out what works best for you. Because it is like at the end of the day, it is self-care for yourself. We clearly we always I mean, we're in this line of profession because we want to be able to help and like provide support for other people, but at the end of the day, we also have to be able to provide support for ourselves.
Yeah, all these assignments, you
Um,
have to dig inward a lot, more than I ever expected. So that's what we have to do to be the best there. I know.
yeah,
Yeah, that'll do it. That was a good discussion. Thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you.